Hi everybody, welcome to the Adventure Design Workshop. I am Ron Lundeen. I am a Paizo developer. I work primarily on the Pathfinder Adventure Path line.
My name is Michael Sayre, and I'm a developer who works on the Organized Play line.
I'm Adam Daigle. I'm managing developer. I've previously worked on Adventure Paths, and now I'm heading the Second Edition Adventure line.
Alrighty. So we've got just a quick outline of what we're going to do. I think that we've all got some very deep adventure sort of design experience. Want to give you all some pointers in that regard. May take some questions in that regard, but what we want to make sure the last part of this is a real workshop idea. What I want to do when we get to that is take ideas from you and put something in. We'll put an adventure together in the course of this. At least an outline of one. I'll go ahead and start off then. In addition to the adventure path development work that I do for Paizo, I've been writing adventures for a good long time for a lot of different systems. I'll also give a quick plug for my blog at Runamuck Games, runamuckgames.com. I do some regular specific RPG adventure design tips a couple times a week. And that's everything from how to structure a compelling villain, and how important that is to an adventure, to the right way and the wrong way to draw angled halls. So a lot of different topics there. I think my own favorite types of adventures to tackle are ones that have a clear villain identified early on, and the players go from seeing the fallout or effects of that villain to more directly confronting the villain to defeating the villain. I really like an arc that makes the players feel smart and successful, and I think going from being sort of the underdog to competence to feeling mastery in the course of an adventure, I think that arc does it very well. But that's my experience. Whatever.
Yeah, so I really enjoy an adventure that presents you with a villain who is not just too powerful for the party, but who may be well known but is inaccessible through other means. This has especially been something that has been really interesting and that I've really liked exploring a lot lately, is villains who are maybe politically protected or are protected geographically, and figuring out how do we get there, or how do we get the ability to confront this person without creating other strings of consequences, can be a lot of fun and can be an intriguing challenge for players. I was talking about this earlier with someone, and I compared it to the Superman comic book arc where Lex Luthor is president, and what do you do when going after the bad guy directly makes you the bad guy? So that's definitely been something that I have been looking at a lot and enjoying from a story perspective in recent months.
Related to the protected villain thing, one of the things I like is when the villain is very clear early on before the party has the capability to really take them on, or they meet them in a different circumstance, and then throughout the course of the adventure realize that, oh, this person I met before is actually the bad guy.
Yeah, they're putting some clues to seed that early on is helpful. It goes back to what I was talking about, making the players feel smart, right? If every time before the first time they met this mysterious person, all the screens go staticky, and then they hear that there's been these crimes through spaceports all across the galaxy, and every time the screens go all statically, like, wait a minute, we met that guy. We've got some clues to go, and then they go to assault the lair, get some information, and everything goes staticky around them. They're like, oh, this is the person, right? You can seed a lot of things about a villain early on, characteristics, without having that direct confrontation.
Yeah, and part of kind of deciding exactly how you're going to seed clues like that and how you are going to get to that point with the villain is also going to require you as the GM or the adventure writer to know how long the adventure is actually going to be, right? Because if it is a one-night game that you expect to last about 4 hours, you're going to have a very different pacing than if you have a 6-month arc of adventures that are going on. So knowing where your adventure begins and ends and how to get there is probably the most important step. Maybe not as important as picking the villain first, because the villain is going to tell you a lot about where the adventure needs to go and what the adventure is going to be. But it is probably the very next thing that you want to start looking at after that, I would think.
So you do a lot of org play dev.
That is correct.
Which does have these time constraints. When dealing with different types of encounters, what are some tips and tricks to stick to those constraints? Because a lot of role play is kind of unpredictable how long that's going to last, while combats are a little more certain. What kind of tools do you use for that?
So one of the things that that we do is we have very often a couple optional encounters that will act as kind of a dial for, this is a thing that maybe I can plug in if I need to increase time because they've been buzzing through and they haven't been spending a lot of time role-playing because they're really kind of focused on the more tactile aspects of the experience. And then maybe it's something I can pull away if they have really been getting into the role-playing, and this is just going to cut into the time we have available to play with a combat encounter that is maybe fun and engaging, but not absolutely essential to the story. The other thing that we have to look at is how many opportunities for role play are in here, and there's some dials to that. There are adventures where sometimes you make a guess and you're wrong. You know, I've developed an adventure before where when I played it, I was very worried about it running over because I play tested it a few times, and every time my group was having really in-depth interactions with certain NPCs, and I was like, getting kind of close to 6 hours. Maybe I'll trim a few things down, and then the adventure goes out to the wider world, and people are like, "Oh yeah, this is really great, but it's been taking us about 2 hours to get through it." So, one of the tools that a GM has at home that we don't necessarily have as people who create published adventures is you know your group and you know what their interests are and maybe how they're going to react to things a lot better because you have that personal touch. And that's where you can really come in and kind of customize and adjust those slots to, is my group going to maybe really engage in role play? Are they people who are really going to lock onto NPCs and want to have engaging conversations? Maybe I allow more time for that. So are they more, I want just enough story to tell me why I'm punching the thing in the face? Then maybe you work on more complex encounters and you keep the NPC sections and stuff down to a more manageable or more simple kind of amount of word count.
This is a good question to poll the room. How many of you are GMs? That's virtually everybody.
That's kind of what I expected. Yeah.
Awesome. How many of you are GMs for a home group where you're making things up on your own? Let's go. That's about how many of you are GMs, but you're running things that are otherwise printed. Actually, some overlap there, which is actually pretty neat.
Yeah.
So I think the conversation specifically about know your own group is very relevant for everybody that put their hands up there talking about running for a home group. Those of you who are primarily running things that are pre-printed, absolutely the expectation from our side in producing them is that they will be customized as needed, you know, folded, spindled, mutilated as needed in order to make it work for your home group. Some of those things we try to specifically call out. If we put in one of our adventures, for example, the puzzle, we know that not all groups love puzzles, so most of the time you'll see a sidebar saying, hey, if your group doesn't like puzzles, do this instead, right? Because we want to help you customize it for the group you've got.
Sorry.
Yes, don't we, Adam?
Well, I want to get this one thing out of the way real quick. There is on the title for this seminar, there was 2E in parentheses.
Oh yeah.
What are, from y'all's experiences of developing, or even writing adventures, what are some differences that, or what does Second Edition bring that are slightly different, or ways that you need to change your adventure design at all, or do you at all?
I do. It is one of the things I do writing for a lot of different systems, and one of the things that I like to keep in the back of my head when I'm putting something together, when I'm determining, as Mike was talking about, adventure length, how much stuff does a player need to level in this? I'm personally much more a preference of milestone leveling over giving XP. I'd like to think we are moving to a world where milestone leveling is the norm, but we're not there yet. And so I make sure in my writing that I'm always, for those people who are tracking XP, it also lands, that the milestone lands at the place where the XP would. The thing that I found with that allows adventure creation to be a little more specific with Second Edition is there is room for just about 12 encounters, and there's a table in the game mastery section of the new book that talks about the specific treasure and levels of treasure expected for each level. So that's a very handy tool to be able to say, all right, whatever my adventure is going to consist of, here's these 12 encounters, I'm going to assign the treasure this way. And sometimes that's a thing that I do after the narrative is mostly complete, and sometimes that's a thing that I do to help me describe the narrative. That is, if it's an adventure where you're going into a golem factory, I know ahead of time I'm going to pick a bunch of golems. But if it's an adventure where you're going into, you have to get through some caves to something else, I'm not quite sure what's in them. Maybe I'll look to see what encounters make sense. Oh, you know, there's going to be owlbears and there's a bunch of hobgoblins with them, right? They're training them or whatever. So that can go either way. But the specific tools to help game masters build adventures in the new 2E book, I think, is exceptionally useful.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I'm working on an adventure path volume right now that I don't think we've announced yet, so I'm just gonna leave that at that. But in the process of creating that, one of the things that was really fun was, because the guidelines in 2E are very clear and straightforward about how things work, it allowed me to more easily kind of decide where I wanted to place emphasis on certain aspects of role-playing in the story by giving the experience for completing that arc and interaction in a way that I could directly equate to kind of how many encounters worth of combat would this roleplay experience be, which I thought was really handy, because that's always kind of been a tool that GMs have in their toolbox, but I think to a certain extent you wing it a lot more in in First Edition and other systems that I've played in. Whereas having that really firm set of guidelines made it much easier to reward roleplay in a structured format that is predictable for me as the GM, and that over time becomes predictable in a good way for the players as well, as they get to understand, like, oh, okay, I don't need to chase an experience point. I don't need to be like, oh man, 10 XP and we hit the next level. Let's go find some goblins that have nothing to do with the story and take them out so we can get there. I really love seeing what happens when a group realizes that the interactions that they are having with the NPCs and the story are just as valuable as what they're doing when they're swinging their swords or casting their spells.
Well, I want to put some specific numbers on that, and I'm excited to, because for months and months we've been working under the Second Edition rules, and now I can just say, right, I can just give the information out because everybody's got it. The way that the leveling works, no matter what level you're going from or to, the players need 1,000 XP to get there. So whether you're going from first to second, or whether you're going from 18th to 19th, it's 1,000 XP. And the amount of experience that monsters give you scale based on what level you are compared to what level they are. In addition to that, what Mike was talking about, there are some specific examples for how to give out, and let me say that an average encounter, that most of your encounters are going to be, will give you 80 experience points, which is why I say it's about 12 to get to the 1,000. The role-playing experience in the Game Master Guide talks about giving out in units of 10 XP, 30 XP, or 80 XP. And it's not an accident that 80 XP is the same amount as an average encounter. So when you build something that's the characters successfully negotiate a fancy dinner party, 80 XP. I mean, I could see a world in which all your 1,000 XP for a level comes from these types of things. The 30 XP is for succeeding at something that's maybe just a couple of skill checks or required a little bit of cleverness on the PC's part. We give both of those out in the adventures that we do, and sometimes it'll be along the lines of, well, if the PCs have figured out that the Duke is a bad guy, give them 30 XP. If they've also figured out that he's a Rakshasa, give them 80 instead of 30. Our adventures don't give out the 10 XP very often, because that's really the, hey, the GM say, hey, that's a funny joke, or hey, I didn't expect you to succeed, but you did. It's the kind of tool that GMs have, the 10 XP unit. But the units of 10 and 30 and 80 help us put some specific numerical accomplishment awards around some of the things that in first edition it was always story XP, and there was not particularly good guidelines for that. We'd give out story XP for completing goals, but now we've got that a little more formalized.
So you were talking about milestones earlier, and I think that is another thing that is really great with the way that we've structured the experience for second edition, is that the XP is largely just a gauge of where you get to the milestones anyways, where you get to the thing that says, hey, you should be the next level now. And so being able to directly equate a role-playing encounter to a combat encounter and plan that, like you said, you could, in theory, create an adventure that was entirely based on role-playing opportunities, interactions, and didn't have any combat at all. I don't know that I would necessarily do that professionally. I definitely have groups that I would do that for, because I have groups that love to just make friends with or negotiate with everything they meet. Some people here, like, there's a, ogre with a blood-spattered club guarding the gateway to this, abandoned castle, and they want to charge the ogre. Other groups are like, why is he here? Is he all right?
What's his motivation?
Why hasn't he cleaned his club? We need to have a conversation with this ogre and figure out why he is doing what he is doing. And so I love having base tools that are very clear that allow you to immediately pivot to, oh, that's the kind of story we're telling tonight. So, yeah.
Right, so some of the most successful adventures are really have a lot of focus on like hitting certain beats and having a certain cadence, and like, so it's not just like room combat and stuff like that, and where it also brings the narrative forward. What are some tools and tips that you could give on hitting the right pace?
Oh, the one of the things, when I mentioned, that the structure is 12 encounters, and I didn't say 12 fights. If I said 12 fights, I didn't mean 12 fights, because 12 encounters. And then one of the things you can do to break those up is by having specific, you can have hazards of different kind. We've grouped hazards generally to include traps and haunts and natural hazards like quicksand and the like. And then the role-playing encounters that we've been discussing. And the key, I think, is to make sure that those are not only well alternating throughout, so it's not here are 8 fights and then 4 social encounters and then you're done, but there also needs to be some level of player agency in the order in which they hit these in the course of the adventure. And even if you know exactly where the adventure is going to start and how they want to conclude it, maybe you have to build back a little bit. Before they confront the villain of the adventure, here's 2 or 3 things they have to do before then. But the more flexible you can be with how your players approach all that middle stuff, the better. One of the things that I like doing is putting all that middle stuff in separate little groups, right? The players must go to these 3 locations in order to get their 3 clues. Each one is sort of its own little mini encounter area. The players then feel empowered to go from whichever one they choose, address it in whichever order they want. And in fact, players will often, they'll do the first part of one and then decide to go do another and then maybe come back. The fact that they've got the ability to do that makes them feel like they're in more control of the narrative.
Yep. And variety is definitely key, right? It's not just the spice of life. It's an important tool in designing an adventure. I was working on an adventure where the story was very specific about who the bad guys were. They were a thieves guild. They were a largely human thieves guild. They were located in a very particular area. And so there were many things that, because of the story and the setting, needed to be true, but that also meant, okay, I need essentially 1 to 3 evenings worth of adventure where there are very similar bad guys that the party is going to have to deal with, and the location itself is kind of fixed. So how do I make this engaging? How do I make it so it's not just, I move into a room, I fight 3 rogues, I move into another room, I fight 3 rogues, and what do we do? So I started adding in all kinds of traps, because it's a thieves guild, you know, and maybe this door is trapped, so now they're afraid of doors because the last time they opened a door, a lightning bolt shot through the party. But then in the next room, the trap isn't on the door, it's 5 feet in and it's a swinging wall scythe, right? And so now they're watching the walls and they're watching 5 feet in. So in the next room, it's a trap door that drops them to a sub-level, and now they're trapped inside of an Iron Maiden. And what do I do with that? And so if you have any part of your adventure that is fixed by the story, you need to start looking, okay, what is not fixed? What can I play with? What can I do to make this interesting and engaging? And environment is a big part of that. Changing the environment, traps and hazards, excuse me, and things like that. And then that also plays into what Ron was talking about as far as how the players need to feel like they are choosing where they're going. They need to feel like they have some agency in it. And so having bigger maps, having more complex maps, having secret doors, having ways for the players to feel like, aha, we found a secret door, and now we've gotten to this area, and we didn't need to go through the thing. Even if the adventure is going to go in a certain direction, and by the end of the adventure, any party who plays it will probably have checked most of the boxes, as long as the way they checked those boxes and the way they found those encounters and moved forward is something that they had control over, you're going to find a really good level of engagement and excitement. And especially if it's a published adventure, because then you'll have people who played it with different groups talk about, oh yeah, when we got to this area, we did this and this. And then another group might be like, oh, well, before we even went there, we had done this. So we had an entirely different tool set. One group might have started with, let's go fight the white dragon directly and then see how that goes. And another group might have been like, let's go down into the salamander lair. And then we came out of that loaded down with flaming weapons and, you know, a fire giant's flaming ballista. So when we did the white dragon encounter, it was very, very different than when you did it without those tools. So, yeah.
And then invariably the group that's like, there was a white dragon?
Yes, exactly.
But Adam, the way you asked that question leads me to think that you've got some ideas as well of your own. Like what's the, rather than room fight, what are the things that you've seen that are improving?
Y'all pretty much covered a lot of that. But one of the things, and this is kind of going into what I was going to lead into my next question about different types of adventures. And one of the things with the right pace, like different types of adventures require different types of pacing. Like an investigation, you need to make sure that it doesn't bog down. You need to approach it in a different way than something that's, you know, like maybe a more sandboxy thing, and which leads to your thing about player agency. Is I really love sandboxy adventures, but I don't like any of those little groups of encounters to be useless. Like they all need to have either a clue or a nudge in a certain direction where the players obviously find that, or they feel like the nudge came from them instead of from the encounter. So I mean, you need to put those types of things in a way that always points to at least 2 other things if possible in a sandbox. Mm-hmm. So you make sure that you get all of them and it moves the narrative forward.
Yeah, every encounter needs to have a clue. Doesn't mean that every encounter needs to be tied to the big bad evil person at the end, right? But it does need to be something that moves the story and the narrative forward. Maybe the clue you find is not related to the end point of the adventure, but maybe it is related to taking you to some place where you will find that clue, right. And it should all kind of flow naturally and take you there. And especially in a sandboxy adventure, you want to have interconnectedness. It should kind of look like somebody trying to explain a conspiracy theory with all of those red strings going from, you know, one part of the map to the other, to the other, to the other. And those strings may look a little intimidating and confusing, but when they are there and when they are laid out, they can actually create a really amazing, cohesive story.
Yeah, and I think that it's important that you don't feel the need to change those based on what your players have done. That is to say, if one encounter is at the waxworks and another encounter says, hey, there's clues at the waxworks, If they go to the waxworks first, get the clue, and then they go to the other encounter, and that points them back at some place they've already been, that's not useless. That makes them feel smart.
Yep.
That makes them feel like, oh, we're ahead. We're winning this. So it's useful to have that kind of thing. That also leads into the rule of three. Anytime you expect your players to get from one place to another, you have to give them three different ways to figure out how to get there. It may seem when you're doing the design or you're doing your game prep that's overkill. Oh my, they're not going to need. What happens if they get all three of these things? That's going to be good. Your players are only ever going to see one, but they're going to be skipping some of them without realizing it. Once they get the one, then they're off to the races, and that works. But you can't say if they succeed at this skill check, that's when the adventure continues. What if they fail it, right? You have to have multiple different avenues to have them move along.
Yeah, never worry about feeling like an encounter that provides a direction is redundant.
Yeah, you really want to avoid choke points. If the only way for the story to move forward is for the party to succeed at a very specific skill check, especially one that they may or may not have, then that's a bad thing, right? Because you're either going to need to wing it on the spot and then come up at that moment in time with a new way for them to get around if they are not capable of overcoming this one hyper-specific obstacle. Or your story just kind of ends with, and then the evil wizard took over the world because you couldn't figure out how to unlock an adamantine door. Great game, everybody. See you next week.
You didn't have lore chicken farming.
That'll teach you.
Yeah, there's one of the most valuable skills, both in GMing and then in preparing written adventures, is learning how to fail forward, which is to say, okay, if they don't succeed, here's a thing that's going to happen anyway. It's going to make their lives harder and more interesting than if they had succeeded. But in either case, it propels the plot forward.
Yeah, it's almost like improv. You know, it's never say no. It's a yes, but. So. Yeah, I would say since we are talking about Second Edition specifically, although this is true of any gaming system, another important thing that you need to kind of have in your toolbox as a GM is knowing what tools are available to the party at the level you're telling the story, and what stories are kind of appropriate for what levels, right? In Pathfinder Second Edition, I believe is it 7th level or 9th level where flight becomes pretty common now. I'm going to say 7th level.
There we go. Seems about right.
You know that at this level, there are probably going to be enough tools available to all of the different classes that flight is something you can expect from the group. So a 40-foot wide chasm is no longer a meaningful obstacle to the group because maybe the barbarian can like rage and grow dragon wings and fly over with a rope, and then everybody just shimmies across, and it was cool, but it wasn't really a challenge, right? There was a very basic tool available to solve this. So you need to tell new stories where the tools that the party has available can be challenged and help them move the story forward, but are not just simple, okay, there's a chasm, we fly, we're done, next thing. You want to know what they have so that you can know how to challenge them and how to keep the story evolving and moving forward and being appropriate to the tool set that the party has available.
And this is an important point talking about Second Edition. Many of the tools have changed. There's no detect undead spell anymore, right? So there's no ability for somebody to automatically say, well, I wonder if, this guy's a vampire. Like, cast my first level spell and, handle that. In addition, we have used what we put across the board in the game, a rarity system where rules are common, they're uncommon, or they're rare, and a lot of those are designed to keep the things that are perhaps a little more unusual or likely to cause a certain type of game to break down, to make sure the GM knows that they're being included. Most of the abilities that allow you to read minds or talk to corpses, the sorts of things that can throw off an investigative adventure, are uncommon in rarity. That's not to say don't use them. What that is primarily a flag to say, hey, there are certain types of adventures that this type of tool will make easier than you think. That's helpful because in Pathfinder First Edition, without that rarity, anybody could be picking up a mind reading or a speak with dead type spell, but now we've got talking corpse and things like that that are sort of at the GM's discretion to decide whether or not it is a tool that the players have.
Well, and that's the big thing that uncommon rarity that we introduced does, right? Is it is not saying that you will not ever have this capability. It is saying that this capability is something that you will gain through interacting with the story, right? At a point in time where it is appropriate for you to gain that ability, and it gives the GM a little bit of a dial on that tool to say, okay, I do want them to have this scrying spell, which is an uncommon spell, because I want them to be able to scout ahead and look at things, but I want them to gain that ability after they have gone and talked to this diviner in his tower and things like that, because he's the one who specializes in this this ability and spell. And so rarity is almost a story pacing tool, where if you need to make sure that an interaction happens and you don't want to just kind of railroad the party into the interaction, you can use that level of commonality to encourage the party to make the decision to go seek out the individual or the item or the place where the scroll exists to go and learn the thing.
So now I do want to make sure that we've got time for the workshop part of this, but if there are any questions before now, it'd take maybe a few 10 minutes for questions, and there's a whole question process.
Now that social encounters are actually standardized, there's XP guidelines for how to reward those sorts of things. How do you deal with the discrepancy that still exists between killing the monsters and getting all their good stuff and talking past them and not having to expend resources, but now you're missing out on maybe their magical weapons or some cool magical items or consumables that they have?
So there are a couple different ways that you can tackle that. One of the ways is maybe a really positive resolution with this NPC leads to the NPC themselves rewarding the players. Maybe it leads to the NPC offering really cool things at a discount. Maybe it leads to an entirely different packet of rewards that come from somebody who has said, I want you to go do this thing, and if you can do this thing without doing this other thing, like I want you to go and get into the castle, but there is an ancient necromantic ritual that surrounds this castle, and every time you kill something, that ritual becomes stronger, and eventually the castle turns into a giant, negative energy charged construct. So if I don't have to deal with that later when it comes knocking on the door of my town, I will happily give you this bundle of things. The other thing is there is kind of a hidden dial there, right? In that if I did not fight the monster, I did not need to chug my healing potion, therefore I did not need to receive an extra consumable to balance out what my load is. So you've got a lot of kind of a broad spread of tools that you can use there to make sure that the party is staying on track loot-wise, as they move through and use those alternate solutions that maybe don't just mean you're stripping all the loot off of the corpse of whatever you just killed.
So actually, this is a fairly decent follow-up, I think, to exactly what you were just talking about. A lot of what I noted in Pathfinder First Edition with adventure design was that you had to work around a lot of different variables, specifically around different play styles. Some of those include things like there were groups that would spam Cure Light Wounds wands and they were at full health at every single combat, and there were groups that wouldn't, and you have to accommodate your adventures for both of those. What kinds of situations like that and like weird tuning things for different play styles have you found that you had to do for Second Edition adventures?
So, to a certain extent, there are kind of some better safeguards in Second Edition than there were in First Edition. Unless there is a heavy time constraint on the flow of the adventure, you've got X amount of time before the world blows up or the candle burns through the rope and the guillotine drops on the NPC you have to save.
Or the castle turns into a big necromantic
Or the
monster.
castle turns into a necromantic monster. There's a kind of a general expectation in Second Edition that you're probably going to be mostly healed up. You might burn through some resources, and the resources themselves are controlled a little bit so that they're more predictable from the GM side of the screen about how many times the party is going to be able to activate a Cure Light Wounds wand or a heal wand now. So the game itself is a little bit better structured into helping guide you to what to expect, and that allows you to kind of keep that moving forward. And then if the party is tackling things through different ways that kind of change the resource expenditure, that goes back to what I was saying before about how you have those dials to adjust what the rewards are to keep the party moving.
We've got some of that. I want to say the new edition specifically outlines that expectations that the party is going to just buff themselves to the gills and then kick down the door and start a fight is not part of the game's expectation. That's, first of all, that's expressly said. And secondly, a lot of the spell effects are at a much shorter duration now. They'll last for a fight, but the expectation is somebody's going to expend actions in combat to do that in order to get that effect up. And this is not. I think that's this question is a particularly good one, because it's not just what do we do as adventure designers to accommodate different play styles, but all of you have to do that as well, right? A couple of your players, they could have a rough day at work and all they want to do is bash some orcs. They're going to play very differently than if they want to, really dig their teeth into some intrigue because they've been sort of craving the ability to have that kind of deep social interaction, for the last couple of days. So that type of balancing is something all of us have to deal with.
This is sort of a sub-question to the discussions of balance and length that you've been talking about. I'm a GM and a game writer who has a really big problem with not being able to predict how long certain encounters take or how much time the party will spend on a certain difficult challenge. What sort of metrics do you guys use to measure how long a fight will last or how difficult it's going to be for your players?
I think one of the easiest or one of the best tools for that is actual playtesting. Run the encounters through your friends, or that's even something you can kind of do yourself. Just see how long a particular encounter will take, how long it takes to kill that monster, how many rolls, how many decisions you need to make to get through a certain puzzle. Those are things I use, and if you do that frequently enough, you end up being able to approximate a lot easier.
Yeah, I was just going to say, experience and experimentation are really the way that you get there, because you can't math out on a piece of paper necessarily how long a combat takes. You can do it once you have the experience of knowing this is about how long this kind of turn takes. This is about how long somebody having this conversation might spend on it. But the only way to get those first numbers is to drill in and play it out and see how it goes.
And it's never going to be perfect. If I can let me just maybe make up an example that has no bearing in real life. But let's say you're an experienced adventure author. You put, say, a black pudding into a sewer, and the pre-gens that the players are given nothing but slashing weapons, right? That encounter is going to be a lot harder than you ever expected when you were writing it and had no idea what the pre-gens would be equipped with. It's just random.
Just hypothetically.
That's right.
We have a question from Twitch user Tin for Lunch. What would be your thought process for developing cronies or unique mini boss type characters for a grand encounter?
So one of the tools that we have in the bestiary that I thought was really cool is there are a lot of monsters who have these kind of dials on them where it says, so skeletons are a really great example of this in the new second edition bestiary. It says, this is everything that is true about a normal skeleton. Here are some things where one of them is usually true about most skeletons, and it might be their bones explode when they die. It might be that they are on fire or things like that.
Throw their heads. That's my favorite one. Throw their heads at people.
And so a lot of times, taking whatever is a kind of standard but more difficult monster for the level and the adventure that the party is playing through, and then tagging on a couple things that change the way that it plays and interacts with the party can be really cool. There is an NPC in one adventure I've been developing who has like a meat hook and chain and can just use it to throw it out and hook people and draw them in close. And most of the rest of the way that that particular character plays is pretty standard fightery type stuff. But they have this one hook that then completely changes how they interact with the battlefield and makes them very, very interesting. Literally hook, yes.
I think as far as like minions and cronies and stuff like that, one of the things that makes them a lot stronger is that if you give them a name, give them a background, give them motivations. Maybe they're only kind of working for this guy, you know, because they need the money but don't really like him. And so if a player can, you know, the ones that always want to talk to everybody, if they can latch onto that little tidbit, then that can kind of give a slight different direction and a satisfying narrative award even, like, or narrative reward for yourself to go, oh man, I made this happen because I latched onto this one personality trait of a named minion.
Yeah, that's one of the things that helps empower is the startlingly typical. I hear this story a lot of, oh, we went in, there was a bad guy and a bunch of minions, and we beat most of the minions, but not all of them, and we defeated the bad guy. And then we talked to one of the minions, and now he follows us around. Right?
Yeah.
That's actually really, it's more common than I would have thought. But there's an advantage in making some sort of reason or motivation and even names for all these minions, because who knows, they might be going on the party's next 3 adventures.
That is my wife's favorite tactic in games, is to just tank her way straight to the big bad guy without taking out the minions, because she feels like if she takes the leader down fast enough, then she can become the leader, and that's much more interesting.
That's good.
True enough. All right, so we want to do a workshop part of this. And one of the things that we want to have come out of this workshop is the outline of a good, solid adventure of our own. We're going to build here in the room. And I want to make sure that we're hitting on a lot of the things that we've already presented as being important in an adventure. Adventure length, adventure level, villain motivations, and a setting. One of the things that we ought to start with is, if we're looking at an adventure, we know we've got our group. Are we looking to create an adventure that is going to span a single evening of play, or just a couple, or something that's going to be several months worth of play? What do you think? Hands up. And yes, you.
Because those are, in my opinion, like harder and require more finesse to pull.
Excellent, excellent. So we're going to do single night, about 4 hours of play. That tells us a couple of things. That tells us sort of the not just the amount of playtime, but the amount of encounters that goes into that. If we had somebody on our panel who's like an expert at 4 hour adventure. Oh, Mike, what do you think structurally, without any of the other stuff, structurally, what do we already know about a 4 hour adventure?
So we know with a 4 hour adventure, we are probably not going to have time for more than 2 really big combat encounters, right? Because a combat encounter is typically going to run about an hour plus or minus 15 minutes. We know that a smaller encounter is probably going to run about 30 minutes, so we probably want 1 or 2 of those, and then we want a nice, robust framework of story. The story has to move at a pretty good pace, so we don't want to get too complex. If there's an investigation, that investigation is probably going to count as one of our big encounters, right? Because it's going to eat up a lot of time as we chase the clues around. So that's kind of the structure we're going to need to work within, is roughly 3 kind of small 20 to 30 minute encounters, and probably 2 big encounters that we're going to expect to take roughly an hour apiece.
Alrighty. We don't need to be necessarily specific, but what levels of groups are we looking for? Low, medium, high, sort of ultra high, from 1 to here.
1 to. I'd say 1 to 3 would be a decent level to go for, because then it's more on the players themselves than their skill sets. Like they have to think in order to solve through combat instead of just fireball.
That's a good point. So we're already thinking that this is going to be low level, first through third level. Maybe the adventurers have one or two like past adventures under their belt, but they're still fairly limited resources, and they have to think about everything. Every consumable matters that they've gotten that they have so far.
And death is a lot more likely.
But yes.
Well, and not only is
and
death...
you grin when you say that.
I grin a lot.
Not only is death likely, but it's a lot harder to come back from, right? And similarly with any kind of negative effects that the enemy might put down, if the enemy is an enemy that, spreads disease, it's going to be a lot harder for a first to third level party to get rid of the disease, and it might be something they just have to live with through a certain length of the adventure. So that's another thing that we now know is kind of true about this level range and how the adventure is going to move forward.
But it also gives us some specifics about the villain. We haven't picked the villain yet, but we already know some things even about the villain. It's not going to be a demon lord or a king. I mean, we're looking at a humanoid villain might be something like a local crime boss or a bandit lord or something like that, and a monstrous villain would be something along the lines of a level 4 to 5 monster, maybe. So,
something in the giant to ogre-ish range.
Giant to ogre to owlbear-ish range.
Owlbear, maybe,
Anyway, so let's think about our villain.
I love the idea of the PCs having to go up against a quasit or an imp that they don't know what it is. So something that can easily hide and just wreak havoc upon the party. That's masterminding the whole thing, maybe masterminding some kobolds or goblins against them.
Makes a lot of
not
sense.
goblins anymore, but
Imp makes a lot of sense there,
right.
and that shape-shifting element to the imp also plays in a lot. You could in theory even have seen it or interacted with it before you ever actually realize what it is. So yeah.
Now I think that let's not necessarily go for the low-hanging fruit here. It's important to have a good villain motivation. Demons and devils have a built-in motivation to corrupt mortals or to do wrong, but maybe that's not our imp's motivation. What is our imp's motivation in this adventure? Let's go there. With the microphone.
Yeah. I'm thinking our imp is something of an outcast or an exile from hell, trying to specifically curry enough currency to get either back into hell or possibly buy their way into some kind of sanctuary or something.
Okay, all right, that's pretty compelling. It sounds to me like some of the types of players we've talked about may actually be interested in helping the imp with that when we get to the end of the adventure. But let's not get that far.
I would love to send you back to hell. Yes.
So the imp's trying to get something. I think before we go a lot further in what the imp is trying to get, let's consider the setting of our adventure. Because this is going to be very different if it's in a wilderness or a forest or a city, and if in a city, what kind of... I mean, there's a lot of different settings that this imp could be going about collecting its currency in. So what sort of setting do we want to have here? Let's go right there.
A trading post.
Ooh. I like trading post because it's really on the outskirts of civilization. It's a place where there's not a lot of ability for the players to get a lot of other resources. It's sort of, here's your shopping list and that's it. And especially when they're low level and don't have a lot to deal with.
And it also allows for a really diverse cast of NPCs, people, because it's travelers from all sorts of different places and stuff like that. And so in that, the imp could be kind of manipulating some of the people there to help with its goals.
Yeah. Well, and trade posts themselves are a type of crossroads and a type of storefront, right? So what better place for, a being that might be looking to trade in souls or anything else? Like, oh, you couldn't buy the gold pans and donkey you need before you head out into the mountains? I can get you those, and I'm not going to charge you a single gold coin.
Are you suggesting a devil at the crossroads?
I mean, maybe a little.
We have a different currency. That's good. Now, okay, so there's a couple of options there, but one thing I feel like hasn't really gelled is what type of scenario this is, what type of adventure we're going to have. Because even in this trading post with the imp trying to get currency, It could be sort of, hey, this imp's been doing bad things, go out and crush monsters so you find out what's behind it. It could be an intrigue sort of based scenario where in fact you hardly ever, maybe in 4 hours, you don't even leave the trading post, right? The cast of characters there are what it's all about. Whatever the imp's been up to could have been a mystery to be solved. So some sort of social interaction, wilderness exploration, or mystery type thing. If we were doing a longer adventure, we might say a combination of these, but I think we've got to focus on just one. So what type of adventure is this?
When you said trading post, the first thing that came to mind was like a Hateful Eight sort of mystery.
I was literally thinking of Hateful Eight as we were talking about this adventure in a trading
I have to admit, I
post.
don't know Hateful Eight. Give me the...
So it's a Tarantino flick, and it's kind of a whodunit, but the answer is just about everybody, depending on what the it is.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So it is. So the action's going to take place in the trading post. We now know we need to pay more attention than we might have in the past about the other types of unusual and/or mysterious and/or helpful characters that are here at the trading post. I think that's actually going to be a pretty big part of our adventure. And meeting with what we've been talking about before, it sounds like that one of our 2 big encounters we're looking for is probably going to be a social encounter.
Yeah.
Some sort of investigation to figure out what's going on here. So it seems to me we've got a good solid villain with a motivation. We know our level, we know our length, we know the scenario type, we know the setting. But because the NPCs are going to be very critical here, maybe we should have a couple that are going to play into this adventure of various types. So let's get maybe 2 or 3 NPCs at this trading post that the heroes are going to have to interact with. We'll go up front here.
We can always have the kind of stereotypical vagabond sort of character, the one who sees a lot but nobody ever sees them sort of thing. So they could be a source of maybe some information or some tips on what sort of odd things have been happening here in the trading post.
All right, this is the kind of character that's wearing the cowl in the corner of the tavern at your typical one. But at an inn, it can be very fast. Let's do just one more NPC to include in. Let's go way back over to the back there. You.
General store owner.
The general store. What's general store owner like? A couple of personality tags.
Kind of taciturn. He's seeing some stuff, but he's
grizzled old guy. He's seen all this come and go.
He's
before.
been around for a decade or more.
Excellent. So we've got
happening.
Excellent. So we've got people to talk to. We've got a setting for them to be in. We've got a villain for them to find out more about and go up against. And that's, I mean, right there, we've already put together a really good framework of a. I think from our perspective, it's the sort of thing we could add just another couple points to and have an outline that we work with a freelancer to turn into a whole adventure.
Yeah, absolutely. So to just kind of recap where we're at, we have a social investigation kind of encounter that is taking place in a trading post. The bad guy is an imp who wants back into hell because he got booted out. And then our kind of 2 main NPCs that we're going to work off are our mysterious stranger type and our grizzled taciturn store owner. That's really compelling. Like, that is a fun story, and we can just fill out a couple details about where that fits in the game world. And we're 90% of the way through an outline.
I think so. Thank you all. That's good stuff. So with that, I think we're going to end up. So thank you very much for coming by to the workshop, and happy to talk more.
Thanks, everybody.